Racists have always done everything within their power to erase the contributions of African people from historical and cultural memory. That's the only way they can survive. They know or have a good understanding who our ancestors were, who we are, and what our children have the capacity to do. I was born and raised in Chicago and lived my life, my early life, drawing. I had plans of being an architect. When I was in high school, I took architecture classes for 2 years. My freshman year in college at the University of Illinois, I majored in architecture. And then I decided that I wanted a change in my life. I transferred to Howard University, changed my major from architecture to design, and received a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Graphic Design and Advertising. So being an artist, and that is what I am, I'm trained as an artist. I see things through the eyes of an artist. I can look at a building, I can look at an object, and I can see its basic structure. I can see symbolism that is embedded in any object that I look at. And then I met Ivan Van Sertima in 1977. And he's the person who got me interested in Nile Valley civilization. I had seen the King Tut exhibit in 1977. I went to see that exhibit through the eyes of an artist, to marvel at the craftsmanship, the detail of the jewelry and the sculpture. And after seeing Van Sertima, I went to see that exhibit again. This time I saw it through the eyes of an African. I could see my image in the face of this boy king. And that was the beginning of my quest to find out who I was as a person of African ancestry. So all the work that I've done as a historian is built upon my talents as an artist. I see history, I interpret history through the eyes of an artist. And the point of fact is that everything that we know about history, we know because of artists and architects. They wrote the books, they designed the books, they created the sculptures and the paintings, they created the buildings and the environments, which we study now. So the essence of our knowledge comes from artisans who have the capacity to convey information from the ages in the works that they produce, which has the capacity to speak to our souls. 7 steps, 9 steps, which lead to the door. 3, 5, 7, 9 represents degrees of masonry. First 3 steps, you become a master mason. Here in the Scottish Rite Order, the next 5 steps take you up to the 8th degree. Next 9 steps take you up to the 15th degree. Next 7 steps take you up to the 15th degree. Next 9 steps take you up to the 24th degree. So in other words, the men who study here at this temple have to master at least 24 degrees of knowledge in order for them to understand the lessons that are going to be taught to them on the other side of the door. So it reinforces the idea that you got to bring something to get something. Nobody's going to give you anything. You got to work for it. You got to demonstrate your mastery of knowledge. That's why my man won the $20, because he answered the question. He had the answer that I was looking for. So you got to bring something to get something. So the 24 degrees of knowledge, the 24 steps, also relates to the 24 meridian lines around the globe. There's certain information about the world that you have to know in order to move forward and retrieve or receive more knowledge. But if you don't know anything, you're not qualified to get additional knowledge, right? So even the doorway is significant. The inner frame of the door is proportional to the inner frame of the doors of the temples in ancient Egypt. That is, the door is proportionally twice as high as it is wide. And this proportion is equal to the mathematical equation for pi to 4 decimal points. So even if you think about the Greek symbol pi, it looks like a doorway. And what it represents is a doorway or pathway to knowledge. The most important part of this building are the symbols on either side of the doorway. So let's walk up the 24 steps, and I'm going to briefly explain to you what these symbols represent. As my daughter Atlantis says, if the book of African history was a book of 1,000 pages, the story of our enslavement would begin on page 996 and would only be 2 pages long. So my job as a historian, my job as a father was to teach my daughter the first 995 pages of African history. And now as a grandfather, my daughter and I would teach her son, my grandson, what we know, and he would take our knowledge and expand upon it. It's important for us to know that our story does not begin in slavery. It's important for us to know that the story of African people is the first story of human beings on the planet. We've been here at least 300,000 years. We were the first humans in Asia. We were the first humans in Europe. We were the first humans to populate the world. And based upon recent genetic research, geneticists have determined that the Africans in Europe mutated, lost their melanin, and became the people that we now classify today as Caucasians 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So given that historical and scientific reality, I choose to study the history of people who have been on this planet for 300,000 years than to study the history and culture, religion, and science and philosophy of people who've only been here 7,000 to 8,000 years. That's a conscious choice that I have made, and I want to raise the consciousness of as many of my brothers and sisters as possible so that they can choose to think like that as well. I made my first trip to Kemet in 1980 with Dr. Ben, and those 13 days that I spent on the Nile transformed my life forever. I had the opportunity to see with my own eyes the historical foundation that I had been miseducated to attribute to others. Knowing that information and knowing that truth sparked something in me to want to share as much of that information with as many people in my community as possible. And as I reflect on that trip that occurred 44 years ago, I now realize that that trip was an initiation. My first 3 days in Kemet, I had some incredible experiences. My first day in Egypt, myself and 2 friends climbed the pyramids and watched the sun rise from the geographical center of the landmass of the earth. Later that morning, we literally walked and stood between the paws of Haramakhet, the Sphinx. My second day in Egypt, I spent about 90 minutes in the pyramids by myself. And half of that time was spent in the dark. The lights were out and the pyramids were closed. I convinced the guard to let me in because I had been in there before. I had a flashlight and I knew my way around. And that allowed me to have an experience in the king's chamber where I was meditating and literally saw myself throughout that trip, saw myself after I returned from Washington, D.C. And it's only been within the last 7 years that I have come to recognize something else that I saw in that vision, in that meditation. I saw myself standing in between the colonnaded hall of Karakamin's temple tomb. So I can look back on my experiences and connect the dots and realize that everything that I've done throughout my life has been preparing me for the work that I've done, including the excavation and restoration of tombs on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. John Henry Clark was and still is my hero. I met Dr. Clark 2 months after I returned from my first trip to Egypt. And when I heard him speak, I knew that that is someone that I wanted to follow. I met Dr. Hilliard actually the same year I met Dr. Clark. I met him at a conference in Chicago. I met Asa Hilliard, I met Richard King and Hunter Adams at a conference in Chicago. And I was just enamored by Asa. I've always been impressed with his spirit, his gentle nature, and his brilliance. And I've been blessed to have been able to work with both of those brothers throughout my early career. Asa wrote the introduction to my first book, From the Browder File. Dr. Clark wrote the introduction to my second book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. I brought them to DC on numerous occasions for conferences. They were my friends. I am almost ashamed to say that when I first started going into Kemet, I knew nothing about Kush. I had no real appreciation for that culture. It was only in 2008 when I met Alina Pistakova, who had begun the excavation of 3 Kushite tombs 2 years prior, that I began to understand and appreciate who these people were. And through my 14 years of directing the Asa Restoration Project, I've come to understand the 25th dynasty and understand the 25th dynasty, the Kushite kingdom in Kemet. I've come to understand that these Africans from the South initiated the first documented Renaissance in recorded history. And what they did when they came into Kemet with the precise mission to restore the land of their ancestors. And they engaged in an activity that's referred to as archaism, where they reached back 2,000 years to the Old Kingdom to bring the best of Kemetic architecture, sculpture, writing, mythology, and spiritual traditions. And they codified much of that information and formulated it, updated it, and left the world an incredible record, which contemporary Egyptologists want to attribute to the 26th dynasty as opposed to the 25th dynasty.
The center of the Kushite moved from, or shifted from the north, from Nabata to Meroe here. So, and Meroe was the great Nubian African civilization, and has a stronger, as I said, and flavor is more African south. So exactly because when they moved here, they introduced or they worship Abadamak, the lion god, Abadamak, and they use a Meroitic language. So because the Nabatan use hieroglyphic language as official language, but when they moved to south, they use their language, Meroitic language. But unfortunately, Meroitic language has not been deciphered yet up to now. Our colleagues working in this language. And also Meroe or Meroitic people spread the knowledge of iron smelting over all Africa. So still there is many evidence for iron slags here, or the iron smelting. And as I said, also Meroe ruled by many queens, as we are going to see in the pyramids there. So more than 16 queens, they acted exactly as the rulers of Meroe. And for Meroe, as I said, here exactly the royal city of Meroe, which extends more than 3 kilometers from south to the north and 2 kilometers east to west. So, and here like a complex of temples and palaces and ceremonials, temples and some buildings, as we are going to see the ruins actually. And all these mounds need to be excavated. So the site is very big, still there is a mission.
I'm pleased to say that I had the opportunity to travel to Kush with Dr. Runoko Rashidi, ancestor Dr. Runoko Rashidi, in the summer of 2016, and to be able to travel to that space after having engaged in the excavations in South Africa for 8 years. I had a greater appreciation for the artifacts that we saw, for what these Kushites had possessed before they came into Kemet, and what they had contributed to Kemetic culture and civilization. So I now have a greater understanding and appreciation of the entire Nile Valley. And I know that the Nile Valley culture and civilization began from its 2 sources, the White Nile in Uganda, the Blue Nile out of Ethiopia. I now know that the story of Asar, Aset, and Heru is an Ethiopia story that is at least 7,000 years older than when it was presented in Kemet. And so if we truly want to understand Kemet, we have to understand Kush, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. We've got to go to the sources of the Nile, because the Nile River was what John Henry Clark said it was, a cultural highway. People, goods, services, and knowledge migrated from the upper Nile to the lower Nile, and they transformed humanity, culture, and civilization everywhere the river flowed. Racists have always done everything within their power to erase the contributions of African people from historical and cultural memory. That's the only way they can survive. They know or have a good understanding who our ancestors were, who we are, and what our children have the capacity to do. So the only way they can maintain their power is to disconnect us from our history and culture and teach us to believe in the lies that they have instilled within us, that African people have made no significant contributions to culture and civilization, and that we literally waited in darkness for the white man to arrive and to bring us civilization, to bring us religion. All of those are lies, and they know it, which is why they resist scholars such as Chancellor Williams, Sheikh Diop, John Henry Clark, John Jackson, Dr. Ben, Dr. Hilliard, Patricia Newton, Francis Welsing, all of our giants who have sacrificed to wake us up by teaching us the truth are like kryptonite to Superman. Once we understand who we are and the sacrifices our ancestors have made to ensure that this information was accessible to us, we have an obligation to know as much as we can, to live our lives by this knowledge which is so transformative, and to experience what we refer to as a metamorphosis, a transformation of consciousness that comes from knowing who we were as African people when we were free and before there was civilization anywhere else on the earth. So once we are grounded in a sense of historical and cultural continuity, it doesn't matter what our oppressors say. It is their job, it is their responsibility to lie. That's what they do. They're liars, they are destroyers, and they have left a historical record of death and destruction that is unparalleled in the annals of human history. So when you know that someone is a liar, then you should exercise that knowledge and disassociate yourself from them. Protect yourself, protect your children and those that you love so that they can benefit from accurate historical and cultural knowledge. Asa Hilliard was instrumental in giving us some foundational knowledge about Kemet. He divided Kemet into 4 golden ages of cultural advancements. The first golden age was dynasties 3 and 4. That was the Pyramid Age, when all of the Mir in Kemet, all 118 Mir in Kemet were constructed. The second golden age was dynasties 11 and 12, which is the Middle Kingdom, when all of the spiritual texts and sacred texts of Kemet were codified. That was followed by the second intermediate period of internal disruption. The third golden age was dynasties 18 and 19. That was during the period where the greatest monuments, temples, and tombs that millions of people, millions of tourists travel to Egypt to see every day were built during this period. It was a time frame in which the Kemites become an imperialistic nation because they had to deal with continual foreign invasions. And then the fourth and final golden age is the 25th dynasty, the period that we're currently excavating right now. That is the period that Dr. Clark refers to as Africa's last great walk in the sun. One of the most significant personalities, female personalities that majority of people have never heard of is Amos Nefertari. She was the wife of Amos, who was a king who helped repel the Hyksos and establish the 18th dynasty, which was one of the most prosperous periods of African leadership. She was her husband's co-regent. Another important personality is Hatshepsut, who is unfairly labeled as a female who wanted to be a male. There's no truth to that. What we're basically dealing with when we're talking about Kemetic history is the European interpretation of African history, culture, science, and philosophy. And when Europeans, for the most part, attempt to interpret African history through a European lens, they typically get it bass-ackwards, and so they only scratch the surface. So it's critically important that we do what Sheikh Diop said, that the history of African people must be viewed and written by people of African ancestry. We must reclaim the Nile Valley and see the correlation between the Nile River Valley and the Niger River Valley. When we do that, we can understand that Africa is a matrilineal society. Women determine kingship patterns, the process through which men ruled, but the women were the power behind the throne. And one of the best examples of that can be found in Amenhotep III and his wife, Queen T. Their statue in the Cairo Museum is the largest statue in the Cairo Museum. And you see Amenhotep III and his wife the same size. When you see other statues in Kemet, you see the woman is typically a smaller figure standing by the side of her husband or by the foot of her husband's leg, as you see in the temple of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel. You have these large 65-foot high statues, seated statues of Ramesses, and his wife is a little figure standing by the side. But Amenhotep III's wife, Queen T, was as powerful a ruler as he was. As a matter of fact, when he died, she ruled in his absence. She ruled with their son, Amenhotep IV, and basically held his hand as he matured into his role as king. And Amenhotep IV ultimately became king and then separated himself from the traditions of his ancestors. And instead of acknowledging Amen, the unseen aspect of the creation, he chose to honor the Atun, the visible aspect of creation, and broke away and did his thing for a while until he died. And then his son, Tutankhamun, came back into Waset. His name was changed to Tutankhamen, and the priesthood of Amen continued. So even Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, had a powerful wife, Queen Nefertiti, who is considered by many Egyptologists as the most beautiful woman in antiquities. The reason they say that is because the Berlin bust of Nefertiti is a forgery. Those who know that it's a forgery. Her face has been altered, her lips have been altered, her skin has been lightened in order to perpetuate this falsehood that the ancient Kemetic people, the ancient people of Egypt, were not Africans. That is a lie that is being challenged by information such as this. And it's important for us to understand that we should establish legacies like they were established in Kush, like they were established in Kemet. It's our obligations to model for our children what manhood and womanhood looks like. And in addition to scholars who are in the classroom, who are writing books, there's also some phenomenal filmmakers. You know, Amadeus Christ, who's done several films that my daughter and I were proud to be a part of, is taking this information out of the classroom into your home. And we have to realize that the first classroom is in the home, that parents have an obligation and a responsibility to have more books in their home than they have computer games, to spend time with their children reading and discussing books, to prepare them to inherit the world. That's what conscientious people do, which is bringing you knowledge that is taking you out of darkness into the light.